We have the highest taxes. We get the worst return for it. We have the highest poverty rate, the highest unemployment rate. We have the lowest literacy rate from our schools. And if Republicans do not offer a forward-looking, hopeful, prosperous future for people because we are burdened down by our entitlement spending and making excuses for it, then I think that we're going to lose the country to the Democratic Socialists, because they are offering something, even though it's wrong and it's stealing, they're offering something that is appealing to people who have nothing.
All right, Jenny. So tell me a little bit, first of all, about Doge and how you got started with that whole thing.
Yeah, you bet. Well, right after Doge was set up at the federal government level, I said, wow, if we think that what's going on at the federal government is wild, we should take a look at California. So I actually set up a Doge program at the beginning of 2025. I had 30 human volunteers, and our large focus was on waste. We knew that California was wasteful. We knew that they were spending money on things that they shouldn't spend money on. And we did a retroactive. So we looked at budgets and reported programs and audit reports that were wasteful. And we also did a comparative study to look at how much other people were spending on things like their electricity manufacturing process and their education programs, and, kind of looking at other states, especially states where California was losing population. And we did that. We ran that during the course of 2025. And we really were doing it more to help equip candidates that were running in this cycle in California with talking points and specific action plans of what they would want to change if they were elected into either statewide office or into the legislature in California. And then in January of 2020, a couple of the candidates who learned about the work that I had done said, hey, we're putting together this task force for California that's really focused on fraud. This was just a couple of weeks after Nick Shirley's first Minnesota video came out. And so they said, hey, we really think that there's a lot of fraud in California, and we're putting together this advisory board. Would you want to be on the advisory board? And just out of my mouth came, absolutely not. I hate advisory boards. I hate administrative bureaucracy and just talking points and a bunch of junk. I said, if you'll let me run it, though, I'll make it real and we'll go catch fraudsters. And so the following Monday, we did a press release. Steve Hilton, myself, and a couple of other members of the statewide running team, which they call the Golden Ticket, as well as a private investigator, somebody from the FBI, and a couple of the members of the actual advisory board that now were on my team. And we said, hey, we're going to go catch fraudsters, and this is our plan. And I laid out a two-part plan. One was to lead a government efficiency division, which was largely focused on the work that we had done before. That was going to be headed by a man named Paul Miner, who's still involved. He's fantastic. Paul actually led Schwarzenegger's plan for the reform of California. And thank God for Schwarzenegger. I can't imagine if we'd had another 7 years of Democrat rule on top of what we've had in California. But also, we opened this fraud division, and that's really what exploded. Actually, I called Nick that week and I said, can you come to California? He landed on Wednesday. So press release was on Monday, landed on Wednesday. First fraud report came out 2 weeks later, and we were off to the races. And what we've seen since then are just really astonishing findings, even for me, for somebody who's been in this for a little while. And really incredible response from the public. They want to know about this. This is not a partisan thing. This is Democrats and Republicans and independents. They want to know where our money's going. They realize that they didn't know where it was going before. They're getting shocked by where it has actually been going or where it is still going in California, and they want it to change. And so everything from arrests to funding cuts to new negotiations, including laws that are going through the legislature to try to stop what we're doing. So it's been a pretty busy year so far on the fraud front.
Yeah, I saw that the Stop Nick Shirley Act, as it's being called, was I think it hasn't passed yet, but it's they're thinking of passing it. Do you know what all that's about, or is not also like the Stop Jenny Rae Act?
Do I know what it's about? Yeah, absolutely. Look, Nick Shirley is a national treasure, and therefore he's an absolute threat in California. And so the Stop Nick Shirley Act is actually a very specific act. And the reason, I kind of get devilishly excited when these kind of things happen, because when something happens in one-party rule in California, it usually is for a special interest or against a good interest. Those are the two reasons why something happens in the state legislature. The Stop McShirley Act, AB 2624, which was presented from the state assembly, was sponsored by the wife of the current attorney general, whose job is to close fraud in California, right? Their job is to eradicate fraud, and they have done absolutely nothing. Rob Bonta, the current attorney general in California, has done nothing. In fact, I was quoted in the San Francisco Chronicle about the Medicare wars over hospice in April, because we had the federal government that came in and arrested some of the fraudsters. Then we had the state government that said, originally they said, good, that was your job anyhow. It's federal money. Then they came out the next week and said, hey, we found 14 people and we're going to close them down. And then the federal government came back and said, hey, we found 455 fraudsters. And so we're going to cut down the whole ring. And it was this back and forth kind of, measuring stick of who could find the most fraud. And it was great. It was the only time in Rob Bonta's entire tenure that he even did a press conference on fraud. And he has 150 lawyers in his office that are supposedly dedicated to fraud fighting, but they haven't found any. They're not closing it down and they're not doing anything for it. So anyhow, the Stop McShirley Act came up. It's a penalty for looking specifically at one kind of nonprofit in California: immigration services providers. And so what did we do? We immediately went and looked at immigration services providers in California from top to bottom. We looked at their Form 990s and we found some really interesting stuff. So actually our most recent fraud report is on an organization called Chirla. Chirla has made national news for other terrible reasons, but for our specific purposes, we found that they were misusing federal funds, violating IRS tax code, and violating employment law. And so there were a couple of key things that we kind of called Shirley out for, specifically because they told us where they didn't want us to look. And so I'm not worried about the Stop Nick Shirley Act. I think it's actually a great sign that we're doing exactly what we're supposed to be doing and that we're actually being effective in California. And if we have to take it to the Supreme Court, I would love to argue for the First Amendment and our right to actually know what the government is doing, to have openness of inquiry and real freedom of the press, which is ultimately what is under attack in that bill. But that's not the only one. I could tell you about a couple other bills if you want to know.
Go for it. I absolutely do.
So we also have the transparency tax. So there's another bill that was moving through the legislature this year. Also has not passed yet, but we're in the final week of the legislature. So these things are going to head to Newsom's desk pretty soon. The transparency tax is this seems like they're just absent of irony, but I think it's hilariously ironic. It's a $66 tax on a per hour rate for any records requests. So, of course, a lot of what we're doing, because we're not a legal entity that is eligible for subpoenas, involves standard citizen records requests. And so when we do that, what they're saying is, sorry, that puts a burden on the government. And we're saying your spending puts a burden on us. And so we think that it's actually righteous for us to ask for these things. There have been other laws that have been attempted to pass like that, not just in California, but in other states that have been struck down by the courts. So again, we suspect that this is just an intimidation tactic, and we will keep going. We will continue to ask for absolutely everything we want or need. They will stonewall it every possible way that they can. And that's one of the things that I'll talk about, is this dance between federal cooperation, where the federal government is enforcing the law in California where California is unwilling to, and then what we're actually doing, and specifically my run for Congress, that came out of a couple of these findings, because where we realized we the people are not able to hold the government accountable, are some of those key passions that I have.
Yeah, I saw on your guys' website that you found $370 million in a cannabis tax revenue that was siphoned off and went to the Democrats. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was the first one. And this is where my eyes were open, because I thought that things were bad. I thought that the waste was bad. I really didn't know that not just George Soros or Hollywood were funding this weaponization against conservatives and libertarians in California, but that actually the taxpayers were funding this apparatus. And that's really what this revealed to us. So I'll just give you the backstory of it. I've effectively in the last couple of years gone very vocal for advocating against almost every proposition that's put in the ballot by special interests, because they all follow a very similar structure to the one that I'll explain to you now. Cannabis tax was legalized in 2015 in California. With the legalization, which was done by ballot measure, so we voted on it in California, there was a sequestered fund of, we didn't know exactly how much it would be because we didn't know what cannabis sales would be, but it ended up being around $35 million a year, sequestered out of the taxes that were collected for cannabis into a fund for substance abuse prevention. And everyone that I've asked, what do you envision when you think of substance abuse prevention, seems not to imagine what the Democrats have ended up using this money for. And so the way that they separated it from the normal course of funding action is that they took the money collected into the CDFTA, which is the core body inside Sacramento. They funneled the money through a secondary nonprofit called the Center for Sierra Health Foundation. Happens to also be the same nonprofit that Jennifer Siebel Newsom and Gavin Newsom had behested or dedicated payments paid into from their donors for corporate interests as well. So this is a very well-funded organization. They took an 18% fee on those $35 million a year, pretty good fee if you can get it, to administer grants. And then out of that, over the 10 years, they administered over 500 grants, micro-granted to organizations conveniently under the federal fraud prosecution limit of $1.5 million. And so each one of these grants went to organizations that conducted activities such as the following: LGBTQ storytelling in the Central Valley, our agriculture area, doxing ICE agents in Ventura County, which is another agricultural area, registering Sikh high school students to vote for Democrats, Democrat door knocking. I mean, and you just go down the list and there isn't not one legitimate grant or organization that has honestly even any attempt to disguise itself as a substance abuse prevention program. And what happened is that the Democrats, because they have our legislature captive and the courts captive in California, they said, we're going to redefine political activity, political advocacy as substance abuse prevention because it gets people off their couches and out the door.
So insanely corrupt.
So this to me was kind of like, oh my God, if they did it once, if they did it this one time with this one program, this tiny little $370 million program, that's a sneeze in a California year. And that wasn't even over 1 year, that was over a decade. Just imagine what other programs are and what's actually happening through our entitlement funding and other pieces of the process. And so we opened up a fraud tip line. We now have over 2,000 tips that have come in through this fraud tip line for us to investigate. They're everything from in-office whistleblowers to people who are contractors of organizations. And again, I thought that we would find some layering, like 5, in the same kinds of organizations. I mean, they are across the state, across every government program, federally funded, state funded, local funded. I mean, the fraud is a culture in California. We are an empire of fraud. And I'm honestly unsure what legitimate government activity is happening after taking a look at all of the fraud that's happening in California. And so anyhow, it creates a backdrop for a lot of people to say, okay, interesting. So we have the highest taxes, we get the worst return for it, we have the highest poverty rate, the highest unemployment rate, we have the lowest literacy rate from our schools. So maybe it's not that we're spending too little. Maybe it's that we're actually spending money on things that don't move the needle for the average person. And all we're doing is enriching the political class. And this is where we're finding really bipartisan support across the aisle, across the districts. And the only talking point that Newsom has tried to come up with so far is, no, there's nothing to see here. But clearly there is something to see. We keep finding it. We are prosecuting people. We're taking them out of bodegas in handcuffs because they're fraudulently, moving funds out of the SNAP program and into cash paying people's pockets. I mean, these fraud schemes are not new. They're not small. They're well established. They're large. They're touching millions of people in California. And they have built an entire durable voter education and voter get out the vote ballot harvesting effort in California funded by taxpayers. And so the federal government has begun to get involved in this, not just because it's their dollars, but also because federal law is being broken by these organizations that have operated as though they have no accountability. However, they kind of forgot they're still part of the United States of America. California is not its own country. And so we're making some pretty big headway. And so we've seen arrests, we've seen funding cut off, and we've seen the revision of funding for a lot of these programs continue to go forward.
Yeah, it's not shocking to me that after USAID gets defunded, the DNC goes broke. I'm just saying, just not accusing anyone of anything, but those two things happened at the same time.
Yeah. There's
Uh,
nothing to see here. Look, I don't know what they'll have left if we, but here's the thing. This is a house of cards, right? This is entirely dependent on everybody looking the same way in the same trick mirror and not seeing anything behind it. And that's one of the reasons that I've gotten so passionate about people's accountability to the government, not the government's accountability to people. Because if we actually understood, like the way that we're finding this, by the way, people say, are you going undercover? Tell us about your process. And I have to deflate the expectations and I just say, we're reading. These people are writing this stuff in their Form 990s, their IRS filing forms. They are telling us how they are breaking the law. They are proud to do it. Chirla told us that they hire undocumented workers to knock doors for candidates. They're a 501c3. They're not allowed to do that. Like these organizations, Chirla, by the way, has 3 offices in Mexico that taxpayers fund, pre-immigration offices. Why are we doing that? And so but here's the issue, right? We can find that in retrospect once the money has been funded and once the money has been spent. But we can't find it at a granular enough level to say, hey, why did you spend $7,000 on Starbucks cards? Were you just funneling that money through some kind of back office secondary site? And so the real granular level of accountability, I think, is the next step. And I would love to see the Freedom of Information Act reformed, not to allow us to ask for information, but actually to mandate public reporting. So I'd like to flip that on its head so that we have even more transparency required of our government. And I think what that will do is actually drive our government to do more things itself rather than subcontracting 90% of the work to these organizations that then don't do what we, the taxpayers, want them to do, or to just return the money to taxpayers in the first place and allow us to enable businesses and nonprofits in our local communities to fill some of those gaps.
Yeah, and in the same vein with the federal or the California state fraud, it just makes me think of homelessness. Like $37 billion since 2019, and I'm convinced the entire thing's over. Homelessness has gotten worse since they spent $37 billion. Did you guys look into that at all? What do you think? Where is all this money going?
Into that. So I can actually walk you through Project Homekey, one of our investigations, as an example of what you see inside the homeless industrial complex. But I just want to begin by saying that one of the very little reported issues in homelessness prevention in California is that there's only one thing that is disallowed for funding from any state agency in California, and that is required sober living. That tells you everything that you need to know, because there is not $1 of that $37 billion that went and said, hey, you've got to come into this room, and in order to sleep here, you have to stay clean. We do drug testing. We do work testing. So you can't have a workforce program if people are not sober. You cannot have a education program if people are not sober. You can't actually provide for a better life if people are not sober. All that you're doing is in-housing drug use into communities that don't want it. That's all that you're doing, unless you actually require sober mandated programs. And there's a ton of research that shows like sober living is the only pathway out of homelessness, right? There isn't a way that you can kind of become housed and also maintain your same habits that led you to the streets in the first place. It's irrational actually to think like that. And so at the core of that, let me just explain this one government program, Project Homekey, and an investigation that we did there. We looked into Project Homekey. They have billions of dollars of assets that have been purchased, both with California funding, but actually largely with HUD funding. And so this was of particular interest to me because if the federal government is funding these programs, I would like to know whether we should continue to fund them or not. So we took a look at it and we found a couple of really astonishing things. Number one, these programs are not built on any kind of free market system. And so what happens is that the money for developers to create housing for the homeless, which is completely open in terms of its definition. It could be an apartment. It could be a safe house for a night. It could be a permanent co-housing, like dorms. It could be a lot of different types of things. But what the developers chose to develop were apartments, because guess what? They were really good at building apartments and understood what apartments were. They knew how to convert hotels to apartments, and they knew how to build apartments from the ground up. So we went to South Central LA and we stood in front of a building. The land had been purchased for $337,000. The Project Homekey came in and gave them, based on a paper estimate, $48 million on the first day of the project. Not in tranches like you would with a loan, not like, hey, finish the foundation that will give you the next piece. $48 million wired into the bank account. And then they were able to build it. It took them 7 years with accelerated permits. So every Project Homekey had an accelerated permit process where it was 3 months or under. And so you have rapid permits, you have money paid up front, and guess what happened? It took them 7 years to complete this project. And then after it was completed, you can probably imagine what happens next. Guess how many homeless people move in? It turns out there's actually no definition of who needs to occupy this. They don't have to come from a tent or an RV or a homeless encampment on Skid Row. In fact, the state of California redefined it as people who may be at risk of homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, there was no occupancy requirement. And so 55% of that building and across the portfolio, other buildings in Los Angeles are vacant. So we stood there, did video, and took pictures, and you can see balconies that have no one living in these luxury apartments that were literally built in the shadiest part of South Central LA. And so the developers took that money. By our estimates, it cost around $18 million if they did a full build out to build that entire site, including the land costs. So $30 million was profited by the developers. They also floated the money throughout the entire form of the project, borrowed against it. Mm-hmm. And then they're running a maintenance fee program for this without any requirement to actually fill the rooms. That, just in a nutshell, gives you an example of the lack of management, the lack of oversight, and the issues that are happening on the ground with homelessness. And so, thank God, HUD actually, right after we did that investigation, HUD came in and cut off $100 million of planned funding for this year to Project Homekey because they had not met their reporting requirements. This was the reporting requirement. If we check a homeless person into a hotel, you have to tell us when they check out. They failed. And so that $100 million was canceled by HUD to Project Homekey. Overall, we found $745 million of vacant property in the county of Los Angeles alone. This isn't even statewide. This is just in the county of Los Angeles. Vacant property paid for by taxpayers, sitting empty, not housing the homeless. So that was just a great microcosm of an example of the lack of controls, the lack of transparency. I think if you had this granular project level idea and there are plenty of people that are passionate about government oversight that would love to, even on their free time. This doesn't have to be something funded. I mean, right now, especially, gosh, with AI tools, there's so much that we can do just to say, that's kind of odd. That seems incredibly like, $900 a square foot building cost versus $300. Just looking at some of these numbers and from anybody who's done anything in real estate or anything in the private sector, I think there's an opportunity for us to really enter this age of accountability. And that's another great example.
Yeah, I'm hoping with AI that we can get some tools inside the government would be the best way to do it with, somebody like yourself with access to information that we can't just get out on the internet or on the open market because, and I know I used to work in the housing industry, that it costs more to build an affordable unit in California than a luxury unit. It's absolutely insane and backwards. Which kind of brings me to affordability, which I want to talk about because I love that you're one of the only politicians I hear lay the affordability crisis at the feet of Congress and their spending. That is the number one issue of why everything costs so much. We've expanded the money supply 40% since 2020. That's why everything is so expensive. CPI is a lie. Inflation is way higher than they say it is. And you're one of the people that talks about that. And you've said if you get into Congress that you would hold those people accountable and stop it. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we've got to rein it in. Look, I think that I run a business. I bought it when I was 31. And so it matters to me. It's important to me that the business runs well. And and we actually even shifted something inside our own business when we started to think about budgeting, when we recognized how easy it is to bloat a budget. And we did a project called Defend the Spend in our current business. And so instead of saying we're going to entitle programs into perpetuity and we're naturally going to expect that they're going to receive funding, we just set internal expectations in our company that every year all of your funding will get canceled. And you have to fight to prove why you should get it back. And I think we're at a moment in you're exactly right. By the way, I sat with a friend in 2020, probably 3 days after Congress passed the first spending act, during 2022. And actually, I think the first act of Congress in 2020 to keep the economy open was a great act of good government, and every subsequent one was absolutely tragic, right? Fiscally tragic. But the key issue for all of those, he sat there and he said, "Oh my God, this increase in the money supply is going to lead to inflation." And I was like, "Yep, it is. There's no question about it." And so we sat in this honeymoon period where rates were low, artificially low, and inflation was increasing because it had to. We had increased the money supply. And I think that you just, when I looked around in California leadership and also in Congress, we don't have a lot of business people who have these understandings. And we also don't have a lot of people who aren't beholden to a career in politics that are willing to kind of ask some of these hard questions. And so I think you're seeing a new generation of us rise up. I'm not the only one who's speaking out about these things. But yeah, look, if the government is wasting our money in this way, if they're that bad at funding programs, if they're that bad at actually creating oversight for the programs that they fund, like one of the ways to figure out what's valuable and what's not is to cut some of it back and to see what's missing. And I think that we have taken on government responsibility for things that both private sector could handle or local nonprofits could sufficiently handle. And this idea of outsourcing, by the way, the third large law that's moving through the California legislature right now that is incredibly alarming is to create an Office of Nonprofit Empowerment to provide legal protection for nonprofits that might be at risk of losing their government funding. I mean, how backwards is that, right? They're effectively government proxy entities under a nonprofit guise. And now they're looking for government-sponsored legal protection because, of course, they're in California, a wing of the Democrat Party. But we really have to do more to hold these people accountable. And so I think rather than starting with a top-down budget where we say, what did we do last year and how can we go from there? I think we're at a time now to say, look, if we have this much fraud in our system, we need to cut it out. We need to give people the tools for accountability. We need to have a more public conversation in America about what our future holds. And the more the government spends and the more inflationary pressure we have, the more affordability crisis there will be. And so it is our job to actually hold that back. No
Yeah,
one
yeah,
else's.
no, I think that's absolutely right. And so does that mean, because we've got a $1.8 billion deficit just this year in 2026. So do you have a third line? Are you only going to be voting for bills that balance the budget? And then if so, that 1.8 trillion, do you think you could find it all in waste? Are there other programs you want to cut? What's your plan?
Yeah. No, look, it's much more complicated than waste. Gosh, I wish we could find it all in waste. But some of it is priorities and expectations. I've absolutely supported programs like the benefits programs this year that have required a return to work for some of our entitlement programs. We need more of that. We need some natural phasing out. Even honestly, I think we're at the place now where we need to start thinking creatively about Social Security and entitlement programs, because when you look at the spend, we could cut these fritery programs away and they're going to make a big difference. But really, like, we have some major spend areas, and we need to get it creative, not about cutting spend, but actually about reallocating incentives. I think that there are a lot of people that operate in our economy that don't require some of the entitlements that they've paid into. I think there are ways that we can compensate them through tax cuts or estate tax benefits that do not incur the same cash expense that we're looking at in some of our entitlement programs over time. So I think we're at a moment where we need to actually look at everything from top to bottom. So yeah, will I exercise and advocate for fiscal restraint? Absolutely. But that question is a really hard one because it's not single faceted. I wish it was. I wish it was just, look, cut this one program and we'll all be fine forever. But it's really an entirely new government mindset. And honestly, Republicans and Democrats have both become big spenders. It's not really one party or another that looks at it. They just look at spending on their things and in their way.
Yeah, I have no expectation that I will ever receive a penny from Social Security. I think the program's going to be belly up by the time I'm around and trying to draw on it. But I'm glad to hear a Republican talk about it because it's kind of a dirty word in politics. Nobody wants to talk about Social Security because everyone's afraid of
Yeah.
the people who collect it now. What's going to happen?
And we should be. I mean, it's an entitlement program. We set it up and we made a promise, and we should keep our promises, and we should keep our promises to our military overseas, and we should keep our promises to people here at home. What I'm talking about, I think, is something that a lot of people have not innovatively thought of, which is there a way to do both? Is there a way to keep our promises? But for example, for you, let's say you have the right to Social Security. You will, and you should. But maybe there's something else that's actually more attractive to you than receiving Social Security. Is there a way for us to offer that? Is there a way for us to come up with an American solution to an American problem rather than a Soviet socialist solution that leads us to a pathway of greater dependence? And I do believe that is possible. And I don't believe that it will be a short-term thing. And there is political risk, of course. The attack ads write themselves. She wants to cut your Social Security. Of course I don't. I want people to have exactly what they've been entitled to. But I do think that there is some opportunity for us to think about reforming the nation for the future. And I do think that some hard conversations are in order for that.
Yeah, I'd like to see a privatized Social Security. But you brought something up that it just reminded me, with us, having kind of a Soviet style here. And I had heard somebody else say that if you were able to pull somebody up who, had died in the 50s or something, and you showed them our budgets now, they would have thought the Soviet Union won the Cold War. Our government is the biggest government that has ever existed on the planet. It is the biggest nanny state. And I'm glad to hear that you want to do something about it because $1.8 trillion with Republicans in control is just terrible. A $1.8 trillion deficit. If the left wins and takes over Congress again, I'm really afraid to see what kind of deficits we're going to be running.
And here's the thing. Again, I think that it's time for Republicans to come back to the table and say, actually, this is not good for our nation. Like we are the party that is willing to move this to a smaller place, not just to entitle our friends and the voters that got us into office in these specific programs. We have a messaging war is really what we have. That's what you're talking about. It's not a money war. It's a messaging war. And that's really where the DSA and some of the crazy conversations that are happening with the DSA will be won or lost. And I think they're actually presenting us with a very specific opportunity right now. They're saying we should create out of private business government ownership. Okay, terrible idea. Anybody who's ever studied one lick of history in the last century, you would understand that this has been tried and failed. But the promise of it, I mean, I was on a call just this week with a Workers United group across the country. This is a group of people who feel disempowered and frustrated with the state of the nation. And if Republicans do not offer a forward-looking, hopeful, prosperous future for people because we are burdened down by our entitlement spending and making excuses for it, then I think that we're going to lose the country to the Democratic Socialists because they are offering something, even though it's wrong and it's stealing, they're offering something that is appealing to people who have nothing. And they are looking for something. They want hope for a future. And if we do not provide it, then that is on us. So I do hold myself and other members of my party accountable for those kinds of messaging because we have to tell the story of why freedom actually is important, why it's valuable, why you want it, where it takes you, what you get. And right now, all we're talking about is what we spend. That's why the spending that's one of the ways that we know that it's gone out of control.
Yeah. It's funny. I've been thinking about the DSA a lot with their, rise to power recently. And as someone on the front lines, aside from what you just laid out, do you have a strategy for how we defeat these people and teach young people that there is something else out there better for them than government-run grocery stores?
Yeah. Well, again, twofold. Republicans actually have to offer a future. We cannot just fight against what the DSA is doing. In addition, we actually have to help mobilize Democrats. As part of our campaign, we have a Democrats Against DSA wing of our campaign. My opponent, Dave Min, votes with the DSA 97% of the time.
Wow.
So he did not come up through DSA ranks originally, but he is a DSA Democrat. Every one of his policies on his website could have been written from the DSA website. And so it is only a nuanced matter of emphasis inside the Democrat Party. So I actually think that even that while Republicans have to offer a hopeful, tactical alternative, here's what you get when you're free. Here's what you get when you study these programs and build a future for yourself. Here's what you get through entrepreneurship. Here's how wealthy you could be by 30, right? All of these programs that kind of really are a part of creating an American economy that's diverse and creative and thriving and exciting. And that's really essential. I think the other piece is really mobilizing Democrats to fight back against the crazy wing of their own party. Otherwise, like the guy that I'm running against is the future of the Democrat Party. It is DSA. There's no brand difference between the two of them. So the two are key. I should tell one quick story about that too. I was speaking we have a large university, the University of California, Irvine in my district. And I went there and I spoke. And there were two moments in the conversation that really stuck out. I love taking questions from students. We have a really active conversation when we're there. And the first one was the student said, you're going to need to come to campus and tell us how college can be free or nobody will vote for you. And so I said, great, let's go through a thought exercise. How would you make college free in a capitalist society? Because I don't know that the government, the taxpayer, should fund a oppression in agriculture degree at a California university. Like, I can't think of a financial reason why our government, through the taxpayer system, should fund that program. That doesn't make any sense. And so collectively in the room, through ideas that the students threw out, we came up with a program similar to the GI Bill, which was a service-oriented program where we in the U.S. look at targeted industries where we have a lack of labor. And we offer discounted or interest-free loans for programs that lead to labor in some of those areas that would be then paid by private sector companies that would hire these students, and loans would be forgiven by the government as a part of this part of the process. It was kind of this public-private partnership. And I said, and what would happen if some of those organizations actually began to fund these programs themselves and the government wasn't required to do loan or origination for some of these programs? And it kind of got the kids to thinking, okay, there may be a future where there's more alignment between the labor force and our education system. We had a very active debate about, like, should we fund philosophy degrees? And there were a couple of philosophy students that had really great data points and advocacy about how successful philosophy students are economically. And I was like, great, I don't know what the metrics are that we should use. Maybe that's a great way to think about some of the metrics. But I loved the exchange and the conversation and the debate. And the second was a moment in there when they just said, one of the things that we really battle with is that we feel hopeless that there are no jobs. Now, remember, they're entering a job market where they have something like 4.5% unemployment, right? Like, there are jobs. Underemployment was really the key of what they were talking about. And so what I said was, I actually think the greatest wealth building opportunity of your generation is buying a business from your parents' generation, not from your parents alone, but from your parents' generation, going and finding a business that has endured COVID and the Great Recession of 2008 and the bust of 2001. And the kids got really excited because no one is telling them that there's another alternative. So they're not in their parents' economy. They're not even in my economy. I graduated over 20 years ago. They're not in their grandparents' economy. They're in their own new economy. And we actually have to encourage and have messengers that are telling these students, like, go build a business. You can do it faster than you were ever able to before. Go buy a business. You can use even low interest government money to do that. And we should have those kinds of programs to maintain the learnings and the economic value in communities. Like, go find opportunities that were not available to another generation, because those are the opportunities that will define your generation. And I think, like, if they only see what they're losing, it's impossible for them to see where their opportunity is. And there is so much. There's extraordinary opportunity for this generation that they have not seen yet.
Yeah, and the student loans are one of the things that have just completely ruined tuition prices. The Federal Reserve has a report out, I think it's over 50% of tuition hikes that have gone out since like the 70s can all be traced back to when the ceiling for the non-dischargeable loans were raised from the government all the time.
Exactly.
And
Right.
so we got to figure something out.
Okay, something it's been on 40-ish years, but yes, exactly. I mean, and you see this actually, you can see this in other government programs. So we, one of the other investigations that we did on solar panels, it's astonishing what people will charge for solar panels when there's no cap for solar panels, when there's entitled money that needs to be spent, right? And it has to be spent on something specific, then the cost will always rise to the funding availability. It's just like a basic economic principle for anybody who studied it. And so we see that in government funded programs where there are no competitive markets and no price controls. So yeah, you can absolutely see that, right? The schools were not dumb. And so instead of actually just saying, we'll take the student loan for whatever the original rate was, they just marked it to market. And market went way out of whack with whatever the numbers were originally.
It's a bad situation because what happens is the government wants low interest loans for students. So then they say, okay, well, one way to push the interest rate down is to make the loans non-dischargeable. And then the students are stuck with the debt for their entire life, whether they go bankrupt, whatever happens. And so then they look to the government and say, well, the government backed this loan. It's the government school that put me in all this debt. So the government should have to pay it off for me. And I really hope we can come to a solution that is something other than that. I would love to see tuition be brought down because the kids, they're wrong in principle that they want the government to be paying for their school, but they are right that the government played a part in using them every step of the way. They led them along this path. So I would just like the government to step back and say, hey, we're going to fix the non-dischargeable portion of the loans and say, hey, if you go bankrupt, they can be dished just like any other debt. And then the interest rates do what they're going to do with these loans. They should be put at a market rate. And then schools need to be responsible for offering tuition that is affordable to people. That we're not just going to raise the loan ceiling every single time that colleges want to raise tuition, because kids are getting distracted. We have people that are retired with student loan debt. It's nuts.
Well, I work in this space. One of the lines of business that my business has serves universities. We have over 137 university partners, and it's been kind of astonishing to watch even the evolution of labor over the course of what we are managing. And we work in a pretty labor intensive space, in the consulting space specifically. And so over the 15 years that I've owned this company, one of the things that we've seen is that the markets are getting a lot smarter. The labor markets are getting a lot smarter. Universities actually used to play an anchor in labor markets for entry-level labor. They were a quality control house. But as education went largely DEI focused and moved away from standards, when they eradicated test scores and now students can't graduate doing math, what has happened is that in-housing for talent acquisition has led to these organizations running their own development programs and testing programs prior to having people actually come on board. And so what that means is that you, as a really smart high schooler, could actually accomplish the same tasks that somebody who went through a college degree at a top 10 ranked university did. And it's creating the equity that people clamored for. It's actually creating it in the job force, but it's creating it in a way that nobody anticipated, because it's going way beyond the boundaries of what anybody suspected. It's not just now we're going to these students. They're going to people who graduated 2 years ago. They're going to people who never went to college. They're going to people who went to colleges that never would have been on the radar of some of these firms and programs, because once they've gone away from using the schools as quality control for labor, if it goes in-house for the firms, the schools actually have to provide a new value proposition. And that's really the crisis of education that we see right now. And part of the question of should the government fund it at all is whether or not the labor markets actually value the quality control that students produced are offered based on the labor preparation that they have.
And then there's so much is going to change even too. I'm kind of excited for it, even though that I'm done with school with AI and online learning. That's another revenue I think we have. If the private market can come in and offer online education at a really competitive rate, I think you're going to see kids turn away from state schools anyways. And maybe that's what state schools need in order to get their act together, because like you said, they've gone to race-based admissions, and even though the Supreme Court told them they couldn't, they were still doing it. When I was applying for colleges, the Supreme Court hadn't ruled yet, and so my race was taken into account with college admissions. I was in the UC system actually, and the amount of costs I was able to see a lot of be a part of school government, see a lot of their, and it's insane. The amount they pay for everything is just triple any other business would ever accept. No business could ever exist running the kind of margins the UC system tries to run. And something's got to change, because we can't keep paying for this. And
We can't.
so I guess my question for you, going to the federal government is, what kind of stake and what kind of care do you have for these colleges that do federal funding does end up even at these state schools? What do you want to do to them?
Yeah, look, the federal government has done very little oversight. This is really the first administration that in my lifetime where they've gone to the schools and said, actually, you have to adhere to the law, and race-based admissions is one place for that. And my district is largely Asian, and so a lot of our Asian families care really deeply about this. My opponent, by the way, supports DEI programs in universities, which is just shocking to so many people in my district, because of the issues that we talked about. We have so many kids that have merit that came, these are, first and second generation immigrant families that came to America because they wanted to have their hard work rewarded. And we're not doing that inside our education system. And so the first thing is just requiring conformance with the law, right? Conformity has to be a key when it comes to those civil rights. And so that's one thing. But the second is actually rewarding programs that benefit America. I think we've gotten away from that. We haven't asked the question, what kinds of college programs benefit our future? And right now you're seeing equal funding with entire discretion at the school level. So for example, if I wanted to have, and by the way, this is a Cal State Humboldt degree. It's called Oppression in Agriculture, or Agriculture Ethnic Studies. It's about the history of slavery in agriculture, and that is the degree. The degree is in that specifically. So, I really think that the government should take a position on what kinds of programs we're willing to fund. And I think we're going to find a lot of alignment with our labor force if we're actually funding the programs that lead to the labor that we're looking at. And yes, are there some schools that will want to go outside of that because they'll have a different thesis than the government will, because philosophy majors maybe should be the soup du jour? Amazing. They should. We should have that kind of free debate and competition, and we should revise what those views are. But I think there are some generally accepted principles that there are programs and research that are ridiculous that we should not fund. And that money is being wasted instead of funding biotech and engineering and the future of our economic and honestly, our international power system. We need to have the forefront of technology, the forefront of energy, the forefront of defense. And our universities have been and should be, again, the places where those are funded. But if we're funding these crazy programs that don't lead us anywhere as a nation, then we should be able to cut those off. And so having more direct oversight into where the money is spent is one of the things that Congress has been unwilling to do. But I think we're at that moment now, requiring more granular reporting, looking at it, bringing people in front of Congress and saying, what are you actually spending America's money for? And then really bringing that question back to the voters and saying, hey, is this what you want, right? Do you want to have this agricultural studies program funded by your government? I mean, we should let every school have whatever programs they want, but not everything should be equally government funded. And I think that's one of the keys.
Absolutely. That's such a good point, that there's no reason for us to be funding interpretive dance studies and all sorts of, and I say this whole thing's a pyramid scheme. I actually wrote an article on this because what you have is these students get these degrees that they start off, not as crazy as it reported on agriculture. It may, be like, some other liberal arts degree that's not as crazy, but then they can't get a job in the private market. They've got friends at college. So then what do you know? The college says, hey, we got this extra money because, the student loan ceiling went up. We got this cash. Let's start and build development. We'll let oppression in agriculture. So then these kids can go now get a teaching job in oppression in agriculture, but then nobody wants to take the class. So then, okay, how can we justify having this development? So California makes what is the term? Where you're like a social justice. You have to take a social justice case. So now kids are forced to go into these oppression in agriculture classes so that they can be teaching jobs for it. It's whole thing is a pyramid scheme.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, should there be competition between schools? Yes. Should there be innovation in schools? Absolutely. But again, I think that we have lost some of our guiding questions as a society. And this is one of the reasons why I think Trump's America First policy resonated with so many people, because we lost sight of who was first in our decision making. We were thinking about the globe instead of about our nation. And we should recognize that we trade with every nation on earth. We are national participants in an international economy that we have largely shaped. And there are responsibilities to that. But our primary responsibility always should be to our nation. I think in education, the question has been lost. Why is a college education valuable? And therefore, who should fund it? Right? And If it's not valuable, then that's a different question. But for whom it is valuable, not just the students, but actually the societal benefit of it. I think people are even asking this. I have 3 young kids, 7, 9, and 14. And parents of my generation are also asking this about other school. Why is school valuable? Is it valuable for childcare? Because then you have a different kind of school than if it's valuable for social interaction or for innovation preparation or for debate, right? What is the value of paying to educate our students? And I think actually largely, there is a lot of research that shows that elementary and middle and high school education has a lot of multifaceted benefits. But we haven't gone back to some of those core questions. Why are we doing this? Why are we funding it? And if we do that, I think it becomes a lot clearer, because are we spending this money and is it going to the right places is a question too late. Should we be spending this money is the fundamental question we need to return to.
And to whom is really who is this valuable to is one of the most important questions, because when you really think about it, progressives pushed this loan forgiveness on us, but that's the most regressive policy you could think of. College degree holders are the highest wage earners in the market. And if you then say, okay, well, we're going to take the tax money of people who didn't graduate college and then pay for the degrees of people who did graduate college, that is the complete opposite of a progressive system. That's regressive. I didn't understand how they could defend it. The whole thing is
Well,
nuts.
progressives don't require, clear thinking and aligned values with their own principles. If you hold them to that, then I think it's a very unfair expectation. And honestly, I can say that quite openly, because I was a socialist when I graduated from college, and I would have advocated for a very libertarian progressive view, where people should be generous, and if they're not generous, you should make them pay their fair share. That would have been my way of talking, when I was coming out of college. And so, yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, to whom and for whom, who is bearing the cost and who's getting the benefit. And if too few are getting the benefit, and if too many are bearing the cost, and if the wrong people are bearing the cost, again, I think it goes back even to the fundamental entitlement programs. Why do we supply SNAP to people who have Bentleys in California? Simply because they have limited income. Their assets are sufficient to pay for food. Okay? So why should the parameters of this program include people for whom it does not define what the incentives are? And that's, I think, one of the reasons why people cheer so loudly when you find fraud. We closed on 33 SNAP providers and perp walked one guy who was trading SNAP cards, illegally defrauding the government by swiping them, and telling the government that people were buying, chips and salsa. They were actually just handing cash out the door, not using those goods and services for anything. And then that money was being spent on whatever they wanted: drugs, alcohol, liquor. The other organizations were actually just swiping SNAP cards for drugs and alcohol and vapes and other illegal items. But I think, in general, are we okay with that? We are not. And people rise up when they find out, that's not what it's for. And the idea of where this money is going and how it's being spent and whether it's being resold is a fundamental question. Are people going hungry without it? Great, then we should have it. But how long should they have it? Who should be paying for it? How should it be administered? A lot of these fundamental questions, we haven't asked them. We've become so accustomed to them being there that we have not asked, if for the next generation, is this the kind of program that we need, and should we keep it going?
No, you nailed it. That's exactly right. And we're coming up on time here. Could you tell us where people can go find you on social media, your website, all that good stuff?
Heck yeah. Yeah. Everything that in my universe is JennyRayCA, JennyRayCA. So all of my social media handles. I'm most active on Instagram, but I also do have profiles on many of the other channels. And then we have a website, JennyRayCA.com. We also, for CalDoge, have a separate website. So if you are in California or know someone in California that has a fraud tip, we love to get those. You can submit those at caldoge.ai. Would love to have you follow, reach out. We are a massive competitive district in Orange County. It was held by Republicans for over 50 years. And then Katie Porter won the seat. And then just recently, the man that's there right now, he won on the 9th day of vote counting in the last election. And so this seat will be, all eyes on it inside California in the next couple of weeks. And so would love your support for the race, would love your help if you're close by. And thank you to all of you for listening today. I hope that you feel some hope that we're finding ways to really, reform the government. We haven't done everything. There's a lot more to do. And I think there's a really exciting future ahead of us.
Yeah, well, keep giving them hell. We'd love to have you in Congress because, man, I really enjoyed talking to you, Jenny. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.